In 1992, they said it was an overdose. That was the first story. The official-looking one. The convenient one. The one that let life move forward while a woman lay dead, and the people closest to her were left with questions no one seemed interested in answering. For years, that explanation hung over the case like a lid, final enough to discourage urgency, vague enough to keep suspicion from disappearing completely. And if not for her daughters, it might have stayed that way forever. But decades later, the same death people had tried to seal off as settled would return in a very different form. Not as a tragedy everyone had already explained, but as a homicide investigators could no longer ignore. Her name was Janice Randle, and long before she became a cold case, long before her daughters were old enough to fight for her, she was a woman moving through the kind of life that so many forgotten victims were forced to endure. Instability, fear, strain inside the home, and the slow erosion that happens when the person closest to you is also the one most capable of destroying your sense of safety. Reports around the reopened case describe her as being in the middle of an estranged marriage, with her husband no longer truly belonging in her life, and yet never fully gone from it either. That kind of separation is often one of the most dangerous phases in an abusive relationship. It looks like distance from the outside. In reality, it can be the moment control starts turning desperate. When Janice died in 1992, the explanation that surfaced around her death was not the kind that forces immediate outrage. It was smaller than that, flatter, easier to absorb. An overdose. A tragic end, maybe self-inflicted, maybe accidental, but not necessarily criminal. And that matters, because the first label attached to a death often determines the force of everything that follows. If a death is treated like murder, the system leans in. If it is treated like overdose, especially in an era less disciplined about domestic violence and less sensitive to how false narratives can be used against women, the system can start leaning away before the truth has even had a chance to breathe. That is where the case began to go wrong, not with one giant collapse, with something quieter, a framing, a direction, a version of events that reduced urgency at exactly the moment urgency was needed most. Because later investigators would say something critical: Janice did not have drugs in her system. That means the overdose explanation, the one that helped define the case for years, did not simply age badly. It was wrong from the beginning, or at the very least wrong enough to keep the death from being understood in the way it should have been. And once a death starts in the wrong category, every year that follows becomes harder. Evidence cools, memory weakens. The family is left arguing not just for justice, but for the right to have the death seen accurately in the first place. That is one of the reasons this case cuts so deep. Because before it became a story of delayed justice, it was a story of misdirection. A woman dies, the wrong explanation takes hold, and the people who loved her are left with a truth they can feel, but cannot yet force the system to accept. That is a brutal place for a family to live, especially for children, especially for daughters, because daughters do not experience these cases the way outsiders do. To outsiders, it becomes timeline and evidence, old statements and later developments, a story that rises and falls depending on what investigators found and when. But for daughters, the case is not made of events, it is made of absences. Their mother is gone, her voice is gone, her protection is gone. The shape of life changes around that hole, and the explanation offered by the adults around them becomes part of the injury. If they believe it is false, then they are forced to grow up not only without their mother, but underneath a lie about what happened to her. That appears to be exactly the emotional core of this case, because what eventually brought Janice Randle's death back into the light was not random chance. It was pressure, persistence, refusal. Her daughters did not let the old story stand untouched. They kept pulling at it, kept asking, kept living with the conviction that something about their mother's death had never been honestly faced. And when cases are reopened after decades, that kind of family pressure often matters more than outsiders understand. Cold cases do not come back to life only because evidence exists. They come back because someone keeps demanding that the evidence be looked at again. Think about what that means emotionally. The daughters were not just grieving the original death, they were carrying the burden of correction, trying to force the world to admit that the story told about their mother was incomplete and possibly designed to protect the wrong person. That is a different kind of grief. It is grief mixed with argument, grief mixed with vigilance, grief that never gets to settle, because the dead are not only gone, they are being misdescribed. And Janice's case was especially vulnerable to that kind of distortion because the central figure around her death was someone close to her estranged husband, James Randle. In cases involving intimate partner violence, the first story told after a woman dies matters enormously because the person closest to the death often has the first opportunity to frame it, to describe it, to shrink or redirect suspicion before other facts catch up. That does not prove guilt on its own, but it is one of the oldest and darkest patterns in domestic homicide. If the truth cannot be erased, it is at least delayed by controlling how the death is first understood. And for a long time, delay is exactly what happened. Years passed, then more years, then decades. The case moved from fresh grief into cold case distance, and like so many old cases, risked becoming one of those tragedies people mention in a sentence and move on from. A woman died in 1992. The circumstances were disputed. Nothing happened. The file aged. The family carried it. The system did not. But the daughters did not let it die there. That is what gives this story its power from the beginning. Not just that Janice died under suspicious circumstances, not just that the original explanation collapsed later, but that the people who had every reason to be exhausted by the weight of the past kept pushing anyway. They grew up, time changed around them, the world moved on from 1992, and still they kept returning to the same core truth. Whatever people said about their mother's death, they did not believe it. That refusal became the heartbeat of the case. Not science first, not a dramatic confession, not some sudden miracle witness stepping out of the shadows. Daughters, memory, persistence, a long war against official forgetting. And that is why this is not just another cold case story. It is a story about what happens when a family decides the original narrative will not be the final one. Once the overdose explanation was spoken out loud, it began doing what bad explanations often do. It started protecting the wrong person. Because in suspicious death cases, the first version of events carries enormous power. It shapes how police approach the scene. It influences what family members are told. It affects what details feel urgent and what details are quietly pushed to the side. And if that first version comes from the person who benefits most from reduced scrutiny, then the damage can begin before the investigation even knows it is behind. In Janice Randle's case, authorities later said the overdose story did not match the evidence. There were no drugs in her system, and the death was ultimately reclassified as a homicide. But in 1992, the wrong explanation had already bought time. That is where the case becomes more than tragic. It becomes instructive, because Janice did not simply die and get forgotten. She died in a way that was immediately vulnerable to reinterpretation. The world around her death was already set up for that kind of failure: domestic turmoil, estrangement, a woman in distress, a husband still hovering at the edges of her life, a narrative available that could make the death sound self-inflicted or at least non-criminal. Those ingredients are dangerous because they create a version of reality that feels easy for people to accept even when it is wrong. And once people accept the easy version, the harder truth has to fight uphill for years. The scene in 1992 would have been processed through exactly that tension. Not just what was physically there, but what people believed they were looking at. That is one of the most overlooked facts in suspicious death investigations. Crime scenes are not interpreted in a vacuum. They are filtered through assumptions, through whoever is speaking first, through what officers expect to find, through what sounds plausible at the time. If a death is presented as overdose, the room gets read one way. If the same death is presented as assault or homicide, the exact same room can suddenly look completely different. The body does not change, the framing does, and framing can determine whether the truth gets protected or postponed. Somewhere in those early hours, Janice's death appears to have been absorbed into the wrong frame. That does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks bureaucratic. A report filed a certain way, a cause implied too early, a level of suspicion that never rises fast enough, a surviving spouse given more credibility than he should have been, a family left uneasy, but with too little institutional force behind them to challenge what is being said. Those are the kinds of failures that do not make headlines in the beginning. They only become visible years later, when someone finally asks why the original explanation ever held at all. And once that question is asked here, the answer becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because if there were no drugs in Janice's system, then the overdose theory was not simply incomplete, it was false in the most consequential way. It turned a potential homicide into something smaller, something less urgent, something easier to live beside. That kind of misclassification is devastating, because it does not just delay justice, it changes the emotional climate around the death itself. Family members are forced to grieve inside a version of events they may not believe. Children grow up under a story that makes their mother's death sound like something other than what it was. The person most likely to benefit from the confusion gets to live inside that confusion too, protected by the fact that the system's first answer has already lowered the temperature, and temperature matters. If police think homicide, the case burns hot. If they think overdose, it cools almost immediately. Janice's daughters would later become the reason that cooling process did not last forever. But in 1992, they were not yet in a position to force the issue. They were children, losing their mother, while the adults around them were also shaping the language of her death. That means the earliest injustice here was not just what happened to Janice physically, it was what happened to her story. Before the case was ever reopened, before it was ever corrected, her daughters had to live with the possibility that the official version of their mother's death was protecting the man they believed should have been scrutinized most. That is a terrible thing to inherit, because children do not merely lose a parent in cases like this. They inherit uncertainty, they inherit contradiction, they inherit the burden of deciding, years later, whether what they were told was ever true at all. And in this case, that burden would become action. But not yet. First came the long period where the wrong version remained standing. Think about how that would have felt from inside the family. Every passing year would have added new layers of injury. Janice was gone. The marriage history was still there in memory. The estranged husband was still part of the story, and yet the official framing left too much room for the system to lean away instead of in. No drugs in her system is the kind of fact that now sounds glaring, but in a bad early investigation, even glaring facts can sit in plain sight without reshaping the case immediately. That is how cold cases are born, not always from a total absence of evidence, but from a failure to let the evidence change the story soon enough. That failure gave Janice Randle what so many people at the center of domestic homicide cases seek most in the aftermath of a death: distance. Not innocence, not vindication, just distance. Distance from a murder inquiry, distance from immediate pressure, distance from the kind of institutional focus that forces contradictions into the open before they can harden into history. Once that distance is achieved, time starts helping the wrong person. Memories soften, files age, the original emotional urgency drains away, and the family is left trying to preserve what the system should have protected from the beginning. That is exactly the kind of environment in which daughters become investigators of their own grief. Because when the official answer does not fit, people closest to the victim start holding on to details others are ready to discard. Tone, fear, prior violence, threats, the atmosphere around the relationship, the way the husband behaved, the way the death was explained, the feeling that the explanation arrived too quickly, too neatly, too usefully. Those things are not always admissible evidence, but they are often the first signs that the story everyone is being asked to accept is the wrong one. and families remember those signs for decades. That is why Janice's case never truly settled. Outwardly, maybe it looked old. Internally, it stayed alive, because the overdose label had not answered the case. It had only covered it, and covers wear thin with time, especially when the people left behind refused to stop pulling at the edges. The years did what years always do in cases like this. They changed the outside faster than the inside. On the outside, life kept moving. Calendars turned, headlines faded. People who were never close to Janice Randle stopped thinking about the case at all. To them, if they remembered it, it was just an old death from 1992, something sad and vague and already decided. That is how misclassified deaths survive for so long. Not because everyone actively believes the explanation forever, but because, after enough time, most people stop looking at it closely enough to challenge it. But inside the family, time was doing something different. It was not softening the case, it was sharpening it. Because Janice's daughters were growing up under a version of events that never felt right. And when children in a case like this become adults, something important changes. They stop being passive recipients of whatever explanation the adults gave them at the time. They start re-examining it with their own eyes, their own memory, their own questions. And the older they get, the more unbearable the original story can become, if it was false from the beginning. That is what makes this stage of the case so powerful. It is not driven by some lucky forensic rediscovery at first. It is driven by daughters, by the people who had the most reason to let the past stay closed, but refused to. Because reopening an old death is not emotionally simple. It means pulling your mother back into the worst part of her life. It means revisiting what was done to her, how the world responded, and how many years passed while the wrong explanation stood untouched. It means choosing pain again, deliberately, because the alternative is letting the lie become permanent. And for Janice's daughters, permanence was the one thing they would not accept. Somewhere over those years, the case stopped being just an old wound and became a mission, not necessarily all at once. That is not how these things usually happen. It begins smaller than that. A detail revisited, a report reread, a contradiction that sounds worse now than it did before. A question asked for the 10th time, then the 20th, then the 100th. Why was it called an overdose if there were no drugs in her system? Why did that explanation stay in place so long? Why did the man closest to the death seem to escape the kind of pressure that should have followed? And perhaps, the deepest question of all, if their mother had not died the way people said she had, then who had benefited from that story? That question changed everything. Because once you ask who benefits from the explanation, you stop looking at the case as confusion and start looking at it as protection. Protection for someone, distance for someone, time for someone. And in Janice's case, the person at the center of that possibility was still the same one he had always been, her estranged husband. That is the thing about cases like this. They do not always become more complicated with time. Sometimes they become more direct. The daughters did not need some sensational new suspect to enter the picture. They did not need the mystery to widen. What they needed was for the original explanation to lose its grip. Once that happened, the whole case began narrowing toward the person who had always stood closest to the death. And that narrowing is what made the years of silence feel even more brutal. Because the more clearly the daughters saw the case, the more impossible it must have felt that the system had not seen it soon enough, or had seen it and failed to act. That is where the emotional pressure of old domestic cases becomes unbearable. It is one thing to lose a parent to violence. It is another to grow up believing or fearing that the truth was visible the whole time and simply never given the force it deserved. That kind of realization turns grief into persistence, and persistence, over time, becomes pressure. The daughters kept pushing, kept asking, kept refusing to let the case settle into the category of old. That matters because old cases are often only as dead as the pressure around them. Files do not reopen themselves. Authorities do not always revisit old conclusions on their own. Sometimes they do, but often what pulls a case back into motion is someone who will not let it rest. Someone who keeps showing up, keeps making calls, keeps pressing the point that the original story was wrong and the victim deserves to be seen clearly before all the people who remember the truth begin disappearing too. The daughters understood that, which meant their fight was not just about correcting the past, it was about beating time. That is one of the strongest emotional engines in this case. The daughters were not only trying to prove something, they were racing against the natural decay that protects old lies. And every year they kept the case alive. They were doing something the original explanation had tried to prevent. They were keeping Janice's death active in the moral sense, refusing to let it harden into the wrong story. That kind of pressure changes institutions slowly, not overnight, not in a cinematic burst, slowly. A conversation here, a review there, a question that used to be easy to dismiss becoming harder to ignore, a case file pulled down again because the people asking refused to disappear. And over time, that is exactly what happened. The overdose label started weakening, and once it weakened, everything behind it became visible. No drugs in her system, no clean basis for the original explanation. A death that looked less and less like overdose and more like something far worse. That shift is huge, because reclassifying a death changes the moral architecture of a case. It does not merely update paperwork, it changes who is centered, who is exposed, and who has to start worrying about the story collapsing around them. A woman once said to have died by overdose is now a homicide victim. The estranged husband, once protected by ambiguity, is now standing inside a much narrower and darker frame. And once that frame hardens, the years no longer help him the same way they used to. That is where the daughter's work starts paying off. Not emotionally, because nothing pays off emotionally in a story like this, but structurally. The case begins moving again. Not because 1992 changed, because the present finally started looking honestly at what 1992 had been. By now, the daughters were no longer just grieving children. They were the driving force of a homicide case reborn, and that transforms the story. It means Janice is no longer only a forgotten woman whose death was misread. She becomes the center of a correction, a delayed fight for truth, led by the very people who were supposed to be silenced by time. That is why this case matters beyond its facts, because it shows what happens when family memory outlasts official failure, when daughters refuse the first answer, when love becomes pressure, and when pressure, applied long enough, finally forces a dead case to breathe again. Once the overdose story started collapsing, the case changed in the one way the daughters had been fighting for all along. It stopped being treated like a tragic ending and started being treated like a crime. That shift matters more than most people realize, because when an old death is reclassified, the case does not simply get reopened on paper. Everything changes with it. The questions change, the pressure changes, the lens changes. The people who once felt protected by the original explanation start standing in a very different light. In Janice Randle's case, authorities later said there were no drugs in her system and that the death had been reclassified as a homicide. That single correction did more than challenge the past. It exposed it. Now investigators were no longer asking how a woman overdosed in 1992. They were asking how a woman may have been killed in 1992, and why that truth had gone untouched for so long. That is a much harder question for a case to carry, because once a death becomes homicide, every old statement starts changing shape. Every early assumption has to be revisited. Every explanation once accepted at face value has to be tested again, this time against a darker possibility. That is where time becomes both a problem and a weapon. Time weakens memory, yes, But time also strips away the authority of bad first impressions. Things that sounded reasonable in the first hours after a death can look deeply suspicious 30 years later when the original narrative no longer holds. This is where the daughter's persistence becomes even more important. Because reopening a case is one thing, sustaining a reopened case is another. Cold case reviews do not move on emotion alone. They move because someone is still there to keep pushing, to keep clarifying, to keep handing back the same impossible fact until the system is finally forced to absorb it. Janice did not die the way everyone said she died. The daughter's refusal to let that fact disappear is part of what gave the case its second life. Their pressure was not noise around the investigation. It was one of the forces that made renewed investigation possible. And once that renewed investigation gathered momentum, the case began narrowing in a way it should have years earlier. That is one of the most painful patterns in delayed justice stories. When the truth finally starts surfacing, it often does not feel random, it feels late. The core shape of the case begins to look obvious once the wrong explanation is stripped away. A woman in an estranged marriage, a death first described in a way that lowered urgency, no drugs supporting the overdose theory, daughters who never believed it, an estranged husband still standing too close to the center of everything. The more clearly those pieces aligned, the harder it became to understand how the case had been allowed to rest for so long. That is where old cases become emotionally dangerous for institutions too, because a reopened homicide does not just ask what happened to the victim, it also asks what happened to the investigation. Why did it go this way? Why did the first story last so long? Who accepted it? Who failed to challenge it? And what did that failure cost? Those are uncomfortable questions, because they widen responsibility beyond the person who may have committed the violence. They force a system to look at its own role in delay, not necessarily as villainy, often as complacency, or bad framing, or a level of trust placed in the wrong person at the worst possible time. But whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. Years of drift that should never have happened. And still, the case kept moving. Because once an old death comes back as homicide, the clock starts ticking again in a different way. Not forward from the death, but backward from what can still be salvaged. What witnesses are still alive? What records still exist? What pieces of the original scene can still be reconstructed? What statements once treated as background now become central? How much of the marriage history can still be recovered in a form strong enough to matter? In old cases, truth often survives in fragments. The task is not to find one giant missing piece, it is to make the fragments line up before time destroys the last of them. That appears to be what investigators were finally doing, rebuilding Janice's death not as overdose, but as a violent event that had been hidden inside a false explanation. And when you rebuild a case that way, one thing almost always happens. The old center of suspicion grows heavier, not lighter. Because if the overdose theory was false, then the person most closely connected to that theory does not benefit from the correction. He is exposed by it. That is what makes this stage of the case so tense. For years, Janice Randle had lived on the other side of uncertainty. The death sat in the past, the story remained blurred, and time did what time often does for the wrong person. It created distance. But once homicide entered the case formally, distance stopped working the same way. Because homicide gives the past a new present. It says this is not over. It says the old explanation is dead. And it says the people who once felt safe under that explanation may need to answer for it after all. By then, the daughters were no longer asking whether the case would be believed. They were watching the system finally start catching up to what they had known in their bones for years. That must have been its own kind of emotional shock. Not relief, not yet. Something more complicated. The exhaustion of being right too late. The pain of seeing your mother's death finally described honestly after decades of hearing it framed the wrong way. The knowledge that justice was moving, but only after an entire generation of life had already passed. That is the hidden cost of delayed homicide cases. Even when movement finally comes, it comes after so much has already been taken. Youth, certainty, trust in institutions. The daughters were not getting their mother back. They were getting something harder, the truth, or something closer to it, after having lived most of their lives without it. And yet that truth matters, because once a case begins moving toward arrest, it changes the moral temperature of everything that came before. All the years of doubt stop looking like family refusal to accept reality and start looking like what they may have been all along, a long fight against a false reality imposed over their mother's death. And when that happens, the daughters are no longer just grieving survivors, they become the people who kept the case alive long enough for the system to finally do its job. After more than 30 years, the case finally reached the point it should have reached long before: an arrest. Authorities in Washington said Janice Randle's death had been reclassified as a homicide and announced the arrest of her estranged husband, James Randle, in 2026. By then, the original death was no longer just a family wound from 1992. It had become a public correction. The old overdose explanation had collapsed. Investigators said there were no drugs in Janice's system, and the man who had lived for decades on the far side of that confusion was finally being forced back into the center of the case. That kind of arrest does not feel like a normal arrest, not after that much time. In a recent murder case, an arrest feels immediate, urgent, forward-moving. But in a case like this, an arrest feels like time bending backward. It reaches into an old room, an old explanation, an old injustice, and says that the years did not erase what happened. They only delayed the moment when the system was willing to name it properly. For Janice's daughters, that moment had to be overwhelming in a way most people will never fully understand. Not because it fixed anything, it didn't. Their mother was still gone, their childhood still happened the way it happened. The decades of waiting were still real, but for the first time, the case was no longer sitting under the wrong story. That matters more than it sounds, because when a suspicious death is mislabeled early, the family is forced to live in two realities at once. The official one, which says one thing, and the emotional one, which says something else entirely. Over time, that split can become its own form of suffering. It makes grief unstable. It makes memory feel contested. It turns every year into a quiet argument with the past. An arrest does not erase that damage, but it does end one part of it. It says the fight to rename the death was not imagined. The daughters were not holding on to suspicion for no reason. The system eventually arrived where they had been pointing all along. And that is what gives this ending its force. Not speed, not drama, recognition. Recognition that Janice did not simply die in a way that could be brushed aside. Recognition that the overdose story did not hold. Recognition that the daughter's persistence was not just emotional resistance, but a long, disciplined refusal to let a homicide stay buried under the wrong explanation. The arrest made that refusal visible to the world. It turned private certainty into public consequence. But delayed justice always comes with a cost. By the time James Randle was arrested, more than 3 decades had passed since Janice died. That means the case did not return to a fresh crime scene. It returned to memory, to aged witnesses, to lost time, to a family that had already spent most of a lifetime carrying the burden the system should have carried much earlier. That is what makes old case arrests so emotionally complex. They are victories, yes, but not clean ones. They do not restore the missing years. They do not return the victim to her children. They do not give the family back the version of life they might have had if the truth had been confronted in 1992 instead of decades later. So what does justice look like here? Maybe it looks smaller than people imagine. Maybe it looks like finally hearing the word homicide attached to your mother's death after years of being told something else. Maybe it looks like watching the person you always feared was protected by the first story finally lose that protection. Maybe it looks like a record corrected, a charge filed, a system forced to admit that what happened all those years ago was not what it first said it was. And maybe, for daughters who spent years refusing to let the past harden into a lie, that is not a small thing at all. Janice Randle's case now stands for something bigger than one arrest. It stands for how easily a death can be pushed into the wrong category when the first explanation is convenient. It stands for how dangerous those early narratives can be in domestic cases. And it stands for the power of family memory when official memory fails. Because if her daughters had let the old answer stand, this case might have remained what so many others remain, a dead file with the wrong words on it. Instead, they kept pressure on it until the file changed shape, until the death changed shape, until the man closest to that death no longer had the shelter of old ambiguity. That is why this case lingers, not because it is the strangest story, but because it is so familiar in the worst ways. A woman dies, the wrong explanation arrives first. The person closest to the death benefits from that explanation, and the people who loved her are forced to spend years trying to undo what should never have been done to the truth in the first place. That pattern is not rare enough. What is rare is what happened here at the end. The daughters did not stop, and because they did not stop, the story did not end where it was supposed to end. It came back, it broke open, and after more than 30 years, the death that people once tried to label and leave behind returned as what it may have been all along: murder. That does not make this a happy ending, but it does make it an honest one. Janice is still gone. The years are still gone. Her daughters still had to grow up without her, but the lie around her death did not get to survive untouched forever. And sometimes, in old forgotten cases, that is the line between total loss and something closer to justice. Not perfect justice, not timely justice, but truth strong enough to come back for what time tried to bury. Her daughters refused to let this 1992 death stay buried. The case centers on Janice Randle's 1992 death, later statements that she had no drugs in her system, the reclassification to homicide, and the 2026 arrest of her estranged husband, James Randle. After 30 years, the truth came back. Her daughters never gave up. Like, subscribe, and tell me, were they the reason this case was solved?